Good afternoon, LinkedIn Live world. Here's Alan with Adaptive Challenge Consulting again for the next installment of Leading with Personality. And today we're going to do the flip side of the coin from what we did 2 weeks ago. And so, 2 weeks ago, if you remember, we were talking about um, coworkers or supervisors who seem a little bit more driven by emotion, driven by feeling. And we got a little bit into how that intersects Myers-Briggs type. And today we're going to flip the script because in Myers-Briggs organization, the third letter of one's type, thinking or feeling, is a preference for how one makes decisions. And again, we're going to talk. I'm going to give my qualifiers about the Myers-Briggs here in just a moment. But today we're going to talk about the other side of the coin that we talked about 2 weeks ago. Then 2 weeks ago we talked about when people perceive their supervisors or their coworkers as particularly emotional or emotion driven. I'm sorry. Last time it was about perceiving your supervisors as not caring enough, indicating they might have a preference for thinking and not feeling. Today it's going to be my supervisors aren't very logical. Maybe they have a preference for feeling and not thinking, and as they lead, that comes across as not being very principled or logic driven or data driven. And so we're going to get into that as we go. So here's a real quick blurb on me. I'm not going to belabor all of this, except to say that, among other things, I'm certified in the use of the Myers-Briggs. And of course, one of the most important things is that we as a society largely use the Myers-Briggs incorrectly. We use it in an ascriptive way to ascribe instead of a descriptive way, right? Ascriptive is, oh, well, you are an extrovert, therefore you can or can't do this, or you are an introvert, so you can or can't do this. Descriptive is different. It means it's acknowledging you're not an extrovert, you're not an introvert, you're a person with an extrovert preference or a person with an introvert preference. You're a whole person in a lot of ways that have nothing to do with this one preference. But we can, through descriptive language, describe how that preference shows up for people. And so I work with mid-level managers, executives, and teams on trying to bridge gaps in understanding, trying to help them navigate difficult conversations with HR teams, et cetera. And I use these tools, these four dichotomies in the Myers-Briggs, to get people to reflect on their own leadership and how they're leading across difference. And when I say leading across difference, I'm also talking about gender and race and all of those other things that make us us. But also, I'm going to hone in on today the feeling and thinking difference, because half of us have a preference for deciding things through logic and principles, thinking. The other half of us have a preference for deciding through feeling, which is the world of person centered decisions. Isabella Briggs Myers cautioned us to not think that feeling was emotional, because she already, as a woman growing up in the World War II era, she already understood that emotional was sometimes used to be dismissive in a world that was emerging from the Industrial Revolution in her time, right? So a few disclaimers. Oh, a little bit more fun facts about me. I was an improv comedian. I have a successful Etsy shop on the side, which is a lot of fun. I'm a performer. Love going to Disney World. I was just there a couple weeks ago for my birthday, and it was fantastic. And I did not have to cook. I did not have to clean. Everything there smelled good. It was great. Um, every time I do a workshop, I always pause here because we all have intersecting identities. And what that means is intersecting identities is different from intersectionality. If you want to learn about intersectionality, I reference you to the work of Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. I've seen her speak. It's amazing. Intersecting identities is not about systems of oppression. Intersectionality is, but intersecting identities are something all of us have. I have many intersecting identities. I'm white and I'm a man and I'm not currently disabled and I'm college educated and I'm the kid of an immigrant and these are the things that make me me. At no point when I'm going to a workshop or going to do a keynote do I leave the house and say to my wife, okay, I'll see you tomorrow. By the way, I'm going to leave all the white at home today. My whiteness. I'm going to leave all my whiteness at home, or I'm going to leave all my manness at home. I don't get to do that. All of the things that make Alan Allen go with me, all the things that make you go with you. And so if we're going to have any kind of legitimate conversation about leadership, about communication, about working across difference, we have to acknowledge that. And so I know politicians have turned DEI into a scare tactic, because they'll take, 2 minutes out of a 1 hour workshop, and it was the 2 minutes where the facilitator was a little off and said something, and then they'll pretend that that's all of DEI training. It's really disingenuous. But we can't have any conversation about leadership legitimately without acknowledging difference. So from time to time, we're going to reference those things. Also, my hope is that you get an aha moment. Every time I do a training, I show people this logo. 25 to 33% of every audience I engage with is unaware that in between the E and the X in the FedEx logo, in the negative space, there's an arrow there. And it's a beautiful illustration of something that's around us all the time that we're sort of operating with a lack of awareness about, right? And so my hope is that some nugget from today's session lands with you, and that you perceive something that you can never unperceive. When I'm talking to audiences, and legitimately, I did this a couple of weeks ago with some students at a university in Virginia. I did it a month ago with a trucking company in Indiana. I tell them, I'm like, when you see that, if today's the first time you're seeing the arrow, the good news and the bad news is the same. You're never going to unsee it. You can't go like this and then look at that logo again and not perceive it, right? There's another example I use for blind folks, which is the Wilhelm scream. And if you don't know the Wilhelm scream, look it up. You've each heard it 50 to 100 times, and you might not know that it is the Wilhelm scream. A note for my academic friends: I understand that the Myers-Briggs is based on a framework by Carl Jung, and that Jung's methodology would not kind of pass modern university standards, right? He was doing what was called backyard research, which is he had his own client base, which is not representative of his country and most certainly not the world. And so he had his own client base and used them to establish this framework that led Isabella Briggs Myers creating the Myers-Briggs. So I want to acknowledge that. I do think that advances in qualitative methodology and qualitative research now shine a light on what he was doing and say, yeah, a lot of what he did was okay. Is it generalizable in ways that that quantitative studies are? No. Am I about to do an entire workshop where I'm going to do some generalizing about preferences? Yes. And so some of this has to do with sort of the praxis, or the places where my practice and this framework meet, right? And so I've spent the better part of 30 years working with leaders, either within colleges and universities, city governments, corporations, nonprofits. And I'm constantly listening as we're introducing this framework to try to put this framework in its proper context. And I've learned some things. I've learned some things that were hard to learn initially, but things that have edified me and that most certainly help my subsequent clients. And then also Isabella Briggs Myers, I was made aware a few years ago that she wrote a fiction book with some negative racial stereotypes. So if we are going to decolonize this, if we're going to deracialize this, we have to take this with a grain of salt, right? That Jung was working distinctly with European people, and that Isabella Briggs Myers had racist attitudes. And so we have to acknowledge that. Can we still use this framework to help people become better leaders? I'm convinced we can. I think, though, we would just have to have that awareness as we go. If you're new to this webinar series, preference is not about skill, my friends. There's a lot of evaluative sort of systems out there, strengths finders, Holland-based codes, the Big Five. There's all of these different DISC. There's all these different assessments. Many of them are trying to measure what you're good at, because corporations and business culture is very attuned to what people are good at for the purposes of promotion or moving into different positions and those kinds of things. The reason I love the Myers-Briggs is because when you do it right and when you keep it in its little corner, it's not trying to guess how good you are at things. We are notoriously bad at self-reporting how good we are at things. If somebody asked me on a survey how good I was at graphic design, I'd give myself a 10 out of 10. And if you saw some of my graphic design works, especially professional graphic designers would be like, nah, dude, you're a 6 out of 10, right? So our ability to evaluate our own skill is always skewed some, but our ability to evaluate our own preferences, it can be a lot more easy and reliable. And so I can tell you, I have a preference for extroversion when all other things are equal. And if you've been to my other sessions, you might hate that phrase, when all other things are equal, but it's important to understand how to use the Myers-Briggs in its proper context, which is to say that when all other things are equal, I have a preference for energizing from the outside, extrovert. However, if it's people who aren't exactly my people or people who I don't get along with, my extrovert kind of retreats, shuts down. So this is what I mean by all other things being equal. So under most circumstances, I am not afraid to engage with other people, and not just not afraid to, but kind of get energy from it, right? So this is all about preference. These are the four dichotomies. Again, if you've been to the previous sessions, we've already explored extroversion and introversion, intuition and sensing. Those first two dichotomies are two of the most powerful when it comes to working across difference in the workplace, particularly because intuition and sensing, that second one, is about how we perceive the world around us. And that's one of the things we all do a lot more subconsciously, and we less frequently talk about with our colleagues and our coworkers and our supervisors. It's a much more internal process. Whereas this one that we're on, the thinking and feeling, this third dichotomy, we negotiate this out loud with people all the time: roommates, spouses, significant others, friends, coworkers, bosses. We are constantly having to externalize how we each go about the process of making decisions. And because we have to externalize that, this thinking feeling dichotomy is murkier. It's murkier. And what I mean by that is, one of the analogies I use is that in each of these dichotomies, it's like driving with two hands. That I'm intuitive, if we go back to the second dichotomy. And so when I'm not being particularly conscious, I'm driving with one hand, which is my intuition hand. But when I'm being extra conscious about my driving, I'm driving with two hands, intuition and sensing. I understand that I have a preference for intuition. So I put that other hand on the wheel to try to balance that and to try to adopt some of the what sensing preference people prefer, so that I can be a better leader across difference. So this sort of two-handed analogy. But again, that second dichotomy is happening very subconsciously. With feeling and thinking, we are regularly driving with two hands, because people who are feeling are constantly having to sort of justify their decision making to people who are thinking. And people who are thinking sometimes have to justify their decision making filters and processes and preferences to people who are feeling. Notice there I said it's more likely that feeling people are needing to justify their decision making to thinking folks than vice versa. And we're going to get into that in a little bit. But this goes back to some of what Isabella Briggs Myers wrote about, and some about what she thinks were the dominant types in the workplace. Spoiler alert, the dominant types were very, very much shaped by the Industrial Revolution in the United States, where efficiency in production was the driving force in determining what made a good leader. So I'm not going to do this. This is the case study that we did in the last session. So I don't always know who from the last sessions in this session, but I am going to give you a quick summary of this. This is the story of Johnny V. Jean, but I sort of lifted this story from Les Mis. The novel, which I never read, is by Victor Hugo, but the musical, which I have seen, is very famous, Les Miserables. And so the premise of this is that our hero, Johnny V. Jean, or in the show, Jean Valjean, that we've come to know Jean Valjean first because of his crime, because he stole a loaf of bread to feed a hungry family. So it's the way we're introduced to him. And then he goes to prison and then escapes prison. And then he's being hunted down by this guy named Javert, who really has it in for Jean Valjean, whose crime was stealing a loaf of bread, but now has the extra crime of escaping prison. And so in this story, the authors are counting on the audience to be leaning in on feeling more than leaning in on thinking. In other words, if they think that most of the audience would have a very, very strong thinking preference when it comes to how they make decisions, they might get hung up at the very beginning on the fact that this is a criminal and maybe we shouldn't be pulling for a criminal, right? However, the audience comes with us as we understand that Jean Valjean is really the hero of our story, because we understand that the crime he committed, although on paper is a crime, it was also sort of justice in a way that was serving a different kind of law, a more universal law of we should not let people go hungry, right? And so the folks who crafted this, Victor Hugo, and then the folks who created the musical out of this, they're expecting us to lean into our feeling side. So again, just like we drive with two hands, I am capable, even though I have a preference for feeling when all other things are equal, I can totally make logical, principle-based decisions like someone with a thinking preference can. But if I'm sitting down and watching a musical, my default's on. I'm not being conscious like I am in a work meeting. I'm my default, and my default is feeling. And so they're counting on everyone in the audience to have enough of that feeling to come along with them on that journey. So again, each of these three letters, and this is the thing that's so misunderstood about the Myers-Briggs, is that you take the Myers-Briggs or another Jung-based assessment, you get your four letters, you read the description of the four letters, and you think, oh, I know my type. The reality is, each of these four dichotomies tells its own story about preference and tells its own story about how we can be more effective leaders. And so that's why I do these by dichotomy, by each letter. Each letter has a rich, deep treasure trove of pointers for how to lead better. For example, and we talked about this several sessions ago, extroversion and introversion. If you're leading a team and you have an extrovert preference, and your team needs to talk about brainstorm a new idea for a new project, and you know that you've got four people with extrovert preferences and four people with introvert preferences on your team, you, by understanding type preference, can craft that brainstorming activity with your team to be more aware of the diversity of type there. So instead of just saying, okay, team, we got the big project for the Williams contract coming up. We need some ideas. Go. Well, your four people with extrovert preferences, they can hear that and say go, and hear you say go, and they can rock and roll with this, right? The people with the introvert preferences might prefer to brainstorm differently. And it might behoove you as the leader to pass out some index cards and say, we got to brainstorm the Williams account. We got to think about what we're going to do for the Williams account. So jot down a few ideas on these cards, and then we're going to have a group discussion. And just that one little extra phase there can help people with introvert preferences feel more comfortable as they organize their ideas, give them time to organize their ideas before presenting it to the group, because that honors them where their preference is. So that's why we're doing each of these one at a time. So again, this is the most blended dichotomy of the Myers-Briggs in my experience. And what I mean by that is that because we have to make decisions with others frequently, and we're not doing the same negotiation with the first and second letters. We're just not. The second letter in particular is a very subconscious process. Imagine that you and a colleague are both reading an email. You don't stop and compare how you read that email, even though one of you might have a sensing preference and one an intuitive preference. You're not comparing notes. It's more subconscious. But when it's the decision-making time, you're definitely comparing notes. So remember the two-hand analogy. So this is blended because if you're a feeler, you know people who are thinkers, or feeling preference, thinking preference. If you're someone with a thinking preference, you know people with feeling preferences. A lot of arguments come from this and from us not understanding where preference ends and where the capacity to compromise and coordinate begins, right? A lot of conflict comes from that. And again, one of the things is we often pre-map. I know I'm going to my boss. In the last webinar, I told us a story about when I used to work in finance. I was regularly going to my boss, Mike Salzano, who former Dallas Cowboy player, former UNC football player. And I would often come to him with a tough situation where there was someone who needed a loan to get their car fixed because they were in a bad space and they needed to get to a job interview. I'm giving him this very feeling argument. He would come back to me with logic, thinking, hey man, what's her debt to income ratio? What's her credit score? What's her disposable income? The logic. But then he would also give me a feeling argument as well. If you want to hear more of that story, go back and revisit our previous webinar. But that's to say that over time, I understood that he was always going to give me logic. So as I approached him, I would approach him presenting logical arguments, even though my preference is feeling arguments, because I understood that's where he was. So when I say pre-mapping, what I mean is because this third letter is the one where we're always comparing and talking, that this one, sometimes we undercut ourselves, particularly people with feeling preferences will undercut themselves. And it's murkier because we don't come into the meetings necessarily with, I have a preference for feeling in this decision-making process. I know you have a preference for thinking in this decision-making process, and let's be true to those instead of pre-compromising and pre-negotiating or pre-mapping those. So this one is, in my experience, the most blended simply because of how we work. So let's get into this. But, so if the premise of today's session is, my supervisor doesn't seem particularly logical, odds are pretty good that they might have feeling in their preference makeup. And particularly, they might have dominant feeling. If you want to understand what I mean by dominant, I have an online course about type where you can understand not just each of the four letters, but also how those four letters work in combination, which is your dominant, your subdominant, and your inferior. And the inferior, Isabella Briggs-Myers called the blind spot, which I think that language might be a little ableist, but I think it's meant to be an analogy to evoke something we don't know about ourselves. And so when I say leaders with dominant feeling, what that means is that of the sort of four different combinations of the 16, or I'm sorry, of the 8 different combinations of the 16 that would include feeling, F, 1/4 of those 8 have feeling as their dominant. And unpacking that would be a little too beyond the scope of what we're here to talk about. But just know that about 50% of folks with whom you work have a feeling preference, and that of those 50%, another fourth of those feeling is the dominant part of their personality makeup. So again, if you want to know more about that, check out my online course. And I have a new book coming out about this. It's going to be the culmination of this webinar and a lot of work I've done for 25 years around the Myers-Briggs. So, but whether your supervisor has a dominant feeling or simply feeling as part of their type, they might come across as not very logical. They might come across as not very principle based or policy based, et cetera. And so let's dig into this a little bit. Again, I referenced this earlier, that the Industrial Revolution called for leaders to maximize efficiency, right? So it invited people with thinking preferences. And we're going to talk a little bit about statistics as they relate to men and women in the US as they take the Myers-Briggs. And there's a break there, right? But that overwhelmingly white men, and men with thinking preferences were drawn to work in factories, production, etc., things that dominated the Industrial Revolution. And because they had a preference for making decisions based on logic and principle, that helped in all the challenges of the Industrial Revolution, whether it's how to make cars more efficiently with an assembly line, or McDonald's that revolutionized making cheeseburgers by saying, hey, we don't have to cook them one at a time anymore. We can cook them 24 at a time or 36 at a time or whatever, this giant grill that cooks from the top and the bottom. So understand that a lot of our understanding of whether our supervisors are feeling enough or thinking logical enough, a lot of this is contextually in the middle of that we're in a country that had an industrial revolution that was driven by certain needs, right? Feeling is often perceived as being sort of the archetypally feminine way of decision making, and there are some reasons for that. Again, most leaders in the Industrial Revolution were men. Most of the factory leaders, et cetera, business leaders, et cetera. When I went through my Myers-Briggs training, I was introduced to some work by Jean Kumaro, who had some statistics on how gender breaks down when it comes to people taking the Myers-Briggs. Now, so take this with a grain of salt, because this is 15-year-old data. But there was a little bit of a break between men and women, right? That something in the neighborhood of 65% of men in the US who scored thinking on this dichotomy, 65%. And something around 67% of women in the US, again, scored feeling, right? The same statistics, though, they shared that in Africa, it was much closer to 50-50. And in Europe, it was much closer to 50-50. And so, many people are aware of the sort of debate between nature and nurture. Jung and Isabella Briggs-Myers each think, and I believe this too, that we are born with some of these psychological preferences, extroversion and introversion, sort of like neither of my children, I never taught either of my children to be right-handed, and yet they just are right-handed. Some critics of the Myers-Briggs say, well, there's no empirical study that can prove that there's a feeling and thinking dichotomy or a extroversion and introversion dichotomy. And I'm like, fair. And I don't think I've ever seen an empirical study that proves that right-handedness exists. And yet, because we are sort of constantly in an empirical state, as some qualitative researchers would say, that we're constantly doing phenomenological research in a constant comparative way, and we've just understood collectively, we've agreed that right-handedness is a thing and left-handedness is a thing, right? And so, but understand that I have come to believe that society in the US, that our societal norms, at least for my growing up here, 70s, 80s, 90s, definitely sent messages to women that they ought to be making decisions based on people, based on feelings, based on being nurturing, etc. These sort of archetypal feminine parts of our culture, and that men would be pressured to operate in more principled or logical ways. Right. This is a guess on my part, simply because of those statistics I was presented when I went through my training, and how the U.S. diverged from Europe and Africa in this regard. So take that and keep that, because there's some evidence. Although I would love to see more recent statistics. I would also love to see more recent statistics on non-binary folks. But at least this is just good to consider and think as you are leading others. Isabella Briggs Myers, in her book, cited what she called the type A business personality. And A is not any of the letters in the Myers-Briggs. This is sort of a different metaphor, different analogy, I guess. And she said that the type A is the ESTJ Myers-Briggs type: extrovert, sensing, thinking, judging. And so if you're old enough to remember Dragnet, Joe Friday had a famous phrase. He would say, "Just the facts, ma'am," right? So extrovert, sensing, thinking, judging. Real quickly, extrovert probably would speak up regularly. Sensing would want data and facts and not be as worried about context and nuance and things like that. Sensing people have a preference to hard data, quantitative data. Thinking is, again, once I've got that quantitative data, I'm going to be data driven in my decision making, using thinking as a decision making lens, because that's my preference. And then the J at the end is sort of adds fuel to the fire organizationally. The last letter of the Myers-Briggs is very complicated because it has two different meanings. But the shorthand that I'm going to use today is that judging simply means that if I'm putting together a project and I'm using thinking and logic as a primary decision-making lens, also when I'm organizing that project, that J supercharges the organizing part, right? People with J preferences tend to have a strong preference for closure. So Isabella Briggs Myers said the ESTJ is the quintessential type A business personality type. And because of that, in the Industrial Revolution, in the technology era, in the .com era, being data driven has always been given higher status than more qualitative and feeling decision making preferences and filters. It just has. I firmly believe that we are experiencing a dramatic shift in another direction because, in part, of AI in some ways, but not just AI, but even what people used to call Web 2.0 tools. But the bottom line is that I think that the questions of how we can humanize our work is going to be one of the dominant questions for the next age, for the next era. And so, understanding that that Isabella Briggs Myers was trying to push back against being data driven and the implication of what data driven meant, because I'm going to put a little spin on that in just a second. We work with humans, each of whom is made up of multiple experiences, identities, their own dreams. If we recognize that our colleagues and our coworkers and those who report to us, that their experiences are a data set, their identities are a data set, that their dreams and ambitions are a data set, even though often those characteristics I talked about are relegated to, oh, that's feeling stuff. Okay, well, there's quantitative ways of understanding and there are qualitative ways of understanding, and both of them use data, right? There's a misunderstanding in a lot of circles that quantitative means we have hard data and qualitative means we don't have data. No. Qualitative means we have a different kind of data. It might be sort of situational or phenomenological or all in a case, right? The case study, you supervise someone named Samantha. Samantha is her own case study. And Samantha's experiences, her identities, her dreams, each have rich data. It's qualitative data, but that qualitative data can still be put together and used in a meaningful way. So this is one of the ways that we can bridge this thinking feeling dichotomy in the way we make decisions, is by saying, hey friends, data isn't just numbers in a spreadsheet. Data is also parts of the experiences of each of our coworkers. Leadership is, in a sense, the building up of folks that you have the privilege and the responsibility to steward and leader, right? To steward and lead. And so understanding that that each person comes with their own rich data, it's important because this dichotomy, that being data driven, is often used as code for being quantitative data driven, and it shouldn't be that way. But there's much more data that's qualitative. Is it harder to put in a spreadsheet? Sure. Is it harder to compare between people? Sure. Is it hard to compare between departments, between businesses? Sure. And it's still data. And if you want to be an effective leader, understanding that data is going to help you bridge this gap. So what if we got data driven on how to build up our colleagues, how to lead others? What if we thought about their experiences, their preferences, their dreams, their hopes, their professional ambitions as data points, and worked accordingly? So yeah, if you're more committed to logic, so if you're on this call and you have more of a thinking preference, then, I see in the chat, how would you, sorry, Angela, I'm a little late to the chat. How would you categorize when someone makes decisions out of anxiety versus logic? Anxiety in the moment, which really makes their decisions very illogical. It seems different from someone who makes person-centered decisions. Yeah, Angela, this is a great question. And let me say this, that most of what I'm talking about with the Myers-Briggs is predicated on a baseline of being neurotypical, whatever that means. I don't even really know what that means anymore. People with an anxiety disorder, I don't think would necessarily count themselves as neurotypical. And so some of this breaks down under some of that. And Angela, I think that when my new book comes out, I think you're going to really, really, really dig the section on the blind spot, or what Jung calls the inferior function, because hidden within each Myers-Briggs type, and Angela, I'm trying to remember yours. It's not ISFJ or INF. Angela, if you can remind me what yours is in the chat. I know you've shared in previous ones, but that each of us has a blind spot. And so, Angela, to your question, sometimes when people are under stress, they are not using the letter that's in their type to make decisions. So, for example, if you have thinking for your third letter, T, that means under normal circumstances, when all other things are equal, you're relying on logic first in your decision making. But if thinking is your dominant in Jungian terms and you're under stress, your blind spot shows up, and your blind spot is the opposite of thinking. Your blind spot for a person who's dominant thinking is feeling. And when they're under stress, they come out, that feeling shows up as a 5-year-old waiting to throw a temper tantrum. And there's more about this in my online course, and there's going to be a big section about this in my book. ESFJ, yes. And so ESFJ, so that would mean, if that's your accurate type, it would mean that feeling is your dominant. And it would mean that thinking is, when you are under stress, you might default, when you're stressed and tired and at your worst, you might default to logic, but it might be a 5-year-old version of Angela who wants to throw a 5-year-old temper tantrum version of logic, a very juvenile, harmful way of logic. And Angela, since you're here, I'll just tell you, the best technique for managing stress is to lean back on your second letter, sensing. And so next time you're under stress and you're about to make some decision, stop it. Don't make a decision. Embrace your second letter, sensing, because that's not broken. And the second letter, sensing, is about collecting more information. So next time you're under stress, Angela, stop what you're doing and go collect more information. And ask yourself, 3 months from now, 6 months from now, is this really going to stress me out? And there's a method to the madness of those two questions, which is for another webinar altogether. But back to this one. So some supervisors, and Angela, you may supervise folks who, if you have dominant feeling, they might think that you are not committed to logic and principle enough, or that you're too, quote unquote, emotional, this, that, or the other. And of course, this overlays on gender and race and all the other things that make us us. But if other folks listening have a thinking preference, and you're like, yeah, my coworkers don't seem very interested in logic or logical based decision making or anything like that, then ask them to share more of their thought process. If your leaders are making decisions that seem very person based and feeling based, don't be afraid to say, can you tell me more about how you got to that decision? And ask it in a seek to understand way, not in an accusatory way. Why did you make the decision that way? No. Like, more like, Can you help me understand how you got there? Because I'm trying to understand this. And because, like I said earlier, we drive with two hands, and because this third letter is the most murky and the most externally negotiated part of our preference type, they should be pretty adept. They should be pretty ready to say, well, yeah, I thought about this and I thought about this and I thought about this. And you can pick up where the logic and the principle shows up, right? So it's pretty easy to ask for that, to seek to understand. You can even say to your supervisor, you can say, look, I'm more of a thinking personality type. I have a preference for pretty linear decision making, or decision making that's grounded on principles. And I see the decision you're making. I understand the decision you're making from one perspective, but since I'm very principle and logic driven, can you help me understand it from that way? Can you meet me where I am? And the best supervisors, kind of like my old vice president at the bank, the best leaders and supervisors do a little of each. They'll be like, yes, so I'm the leader and I gave you why I made this decision in a feeling way. And now I'm going to meet you where you are and try to give you a little more logic because I understand that's going to help you understand. So these are a few tips on how to work more effectively across this thinking and feeling dichotomy. Um, Coming up, we have our last two in this series, April 16th and April 23rd. This one, we're going to go into that last letter of the Myers-Briggs, the judging and the perceiving. And again, real quick, there's a short way to understand judging perceiving, which is that it's sort of our social organizational type. In other words, you walk past most of your colleagues' desks, odds are pretty decent, even though behavior and preference are different. Odds are pretty good that the messy desks belong to your perceiver colleagues and that the neat desks belong to your judging colleagues. And again, I don't ever want to directly equate preference and behavior. This one and the first letter are the easiest to make an educated guess where your preference leads to a behavior. And so, again, there can be perceiving people with very neat desks. There can be judging people with very messy desks. But if you're playing the odds, odds are pretty good that the social organizational style, the way that people talk about organizing in the office, is one way that this judging and perceiving dichotomy is understood. There's a second way that's much more complex, that's about dominant and subdominant and inferior complexes and how we find the rank order of our letters to better understand what makes us us. And that's another subject for another day. I might add a ninth session just to go in on that to this series. But I hope y'all RSVP for that. And thanks for participating in this series. Also, check out our books over at adaptivechallengeconsulting.com. They're also on Amazon if you're curious. But when you buy them direct from us, it helps me pay my kids' college tuition. So, but yeah, thank you all. Oh, and there's a shout out to my amazing team there at Adaptive Challenge Consulting. These are my affiliates. And if you want to connect on the LinkedIn, as the youth say, find me over there. But otherwise, have an amazing, amazing Thursday.